Night falls over the Kazakhstani steppe. In a Soviet control room, voices crackle through the radio static, counting down in Russian, the concrete walls vibrating slightly with each number. 3, 2, 1. Somewhere in the darkness, I hope you like my Russian accent, a missile streaks upward, its exhaust trail glowing, and it arcs into the upper atmosphere, higher and higher until... flash. But this isn't just any flash. A massive second sun seems to bloom at altitude. An artificial dawn is created that turns night into day across hundreds of miles of bare desert. This wasn't a failed launch, though. This was a live nuclear warhead detonation in the upper atmosphere, part of the Soviet Union's high-altitude EMP tests. And that blast? Well, it was going to fry telephone lines across an area the size of France. And we'll come back to exactly how much damage that all caused in just a moment, because today we're venturing into one of the most secretive military installations on Earth, a place where the Soviet Union learned to split atoms and reach for space, where dogs became the first Earth creatures to touch the edge of the cosmos, because this is Kapustin Yar, a name that probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it really should, because this patch of Russian steppe has shaped the modern world more than almost any other military facility that you've never heard of. It's where Soviet rocketry took its first baby steps with captured Nazi technology, where the first Soviet V-2s flew and exploded and crashed and occasionally worked, and where even today Russia tests air defense systems designed to swat hypersonic missiles out of the sky. This is a place called Russia's Roswell because of the UFO rumors. But the real story, we promise you, is stranger than any alien tale. Our story begins back in the rubble of the Third Reich. 1945. Berlin has fallen, and American and Soviet collection teams, which is a nice way of saying organized looters with PhDs, are racing through Germany, grabbing everything that isn't nailed down. V2 rockets, they're a big get. The wonder weapons that have been raining down on London, turning city blocks into rubble. But they weren't just after hardware. Oh no, they wanted humans too. German rocket engineers, the men who'd built Hitler's vengeance weapons. That's what the V stands for. The Americans got Werner von Braun, who would later put men on the moon. The Soviets, well, they just basically got anyone that they could grab. And that included Helmut Grotup, von Braun's former assistant. Now, Stalin was not subtle about his intentions. By decree on May the 13th, 1946, less than a year after the war ended, he ordered the creation of a central rocket range. The chosen site? A patch of absolutely nothing, 100 kilometers away from, what had been Stalingrad, now Volgograd. Now, to understand just how remote this place was, imagine driving from London to Edinburgh, but instead of passing through cities and towns, you just see nothing but endless grass for 8 hours. That's the Astrakhan Steppe, an ocean of grass stretching to every horizon, broken by the occasional very lonely tree. They called it the Fourth State Central Range because Soviet bureaucrats were known for their creativity. The world, though, came to know it as Kapustin Yar. On October the 18th, 1947, something remarkable happened there. At 10:47 a.m. Moscow time, the ground shook and a pillar of fire erupted from the steppe. The Soviet Union's first V2, or A4 as they called it because they couldn't even admit that they were using German designs, lifted off from launch pad number 1. The rocket made it exactly 206 kilometers before crashing into the desert. By Nazi Germany standards, that was a failure. By Soviet standards, it was the beginning of everything. Leading this operation was a man who deserves to be better known, and that's Lieutenant General Vasily Voznyuk. He's exactly as you would imagine a Soviet officer. He's got a stern face, iron will, and an absolute devotion to rockets that bordered on the religious. This is a good replacement for religion in the very atheist Soviet Union. Voznyuk would command Kapustin Yar from 1946 all the way to 1973, that's 27 years. And under his iron hands, the facility grew from a collection of tents and launch pads to something resembling a small city. And that brings us to one of the strangest aspects of Kapustin Yar. Building a secret town and erasing another. Now, you can't just build a massive rocket testing facility in the middle of nowhere and not have anywhere for the workers to live, unless you want your rocket scientists camping in tents through Russian winters where the temperatures drop to minus 30 Celsius, which is minus 22 Fahrenheit for our American friends, or really miserable if you prefer Simon units. What started as a tent city gradually hardened into something a lot more permanent. Concrete apartment blocks rose from the steps, schools appeared, shops, a cinema, even a park with actual trees. A la-dee-da, Soviet Union. They called the new town Znamensk, and it was unlike any other Soviet settlement. For starters, it didn't exist. Officially, you wouldn't find it on any map. Mail addressed to the town would be returned as no such place, but we assume in Russian. To leave, you needed special permission. To breathe, you needed special permission. I mean, not really, but maybe. The town had one purpose: to house the men and women who were building the future of Soviet rocketry. These were not just any workers. They were the cream of Soviet science and engineering, lured by good salaries, better food than most Soviets could dream of, and the chance to be part of something revolutionary. The catch, though, once you entered Znamensk, you essentially disappeared from the normal world. But this is where our story takes a darker turn. You see, the site chosen for this secret city, it wasn't entirely empty. The village of Zhitka had the misfortune of being exactly where the Soviets wanted to expand their range. The solution was typically Soviet in its brutal efficiency. In 1953, the entire village were given notice. Pack up, get out, you're leaving.
Okay.
No discussion, no compensation worth mentioning, just the motherland needs your land. Goodbye, comrades. Or maybe you prefer bullet? I wish I could do a better Russian accent. They'd wake up one morning, military trucks outside, and they were essentially told to off. The place your grandparents were born, where you were married, where your children took their first steps. It no longer exists. By afternoon, Zhitka was a ghost town. By the next week, it was flat. This forced relocation would later fuel some of the more outlandish conspiracy theories about Kapustin Yar. I mean, why would they need to hide an entire village? What did those villagers see? I mean, the boring truth is that they just wanted land to blow shit up on in the middle of nowhere. Hey ho, we'll get to the conspiracy theories later, don't worry. From V2s to nuclear missiles. Now, copying German rockets, that was just the start. Next was something far more ambitious and honestly far more terrifying. The progression went like this. First came the R1, essentially a Soviet-built copy of the V2. It could throw a 1-ton warhead about 270 kilometers, about the distance from London to Paris, which ain't bad, but it's not exactly world-changing. Then came the R2, which doubled that range, and then there was the R5, which flew at Kapustin Yar in 1953. This beast could hurl a nuclear warhead 1,200 kilometers. It's about London to Rome or Warsaw or Moscow to Berlin. And then, on February the 2nd, 1956, something happened that should have made headlines around the world, except it was so secret that most people didn't learn about it for decades. At precisely 10 a.m. Moscow time, an R5M lifted off from Launch Complex 4 at Kapustin Yar. This was no test flight, not a dummy warhead. This was the real thing, a live nuclear weapon sitting atop a ballistic missile. The rocket climbed up into the crystal clear winter sky, its exhaust drawing a perfect white line against the blue. In the command bunker, men who'd fought in the most devastating war in human history watched instruments that showed them how to make the next one even worse, or maybe prevent it. Mutually assured destruction. Nukes are complicated. It's not for this video. 1,200 kilometers away in the empty steppe near Aralsk in Kazakhstan, monitoring equipment waited. The missile's nuclear warhead, estimated at around 80 kilotons, about 4 times the power of Hiroshima, detonated precisely on target. And this was a world first. The atomic age and the missile age had just merged into something new and terrifying. For the first time in human history, a nuclear weapon had been delivered by ballistic missile. No bomber needed, no warning, just death delivered at the speed of a rocket. To put this in perspective, imagine sitting in London having your morning tea when someone presses a button. 20 minutes later, London doesn't exist anymore. That's the world that was born at Kapustin Yar on that February morning. Dogs in space. But look, Kapustin Yar wasn't just about weapons of war and blowing shit up. It was also where the Soviet Union took its first tentative steps towards conquering space. On July the 22nd, 1951 at 4 a.m., because apparently all historic moments in Soviet rocketry happened at ungodly hours, 2 dogs were loaded into a sealed capsule atop an R1 rocket. Their names were Desik and Sigan, and they were about to become the first living creatures to reach space and return alive, which is nice. Picture the scene. Soviet scientists in white coats gently, one hopes, strapping 2 tail-wagging dogs into what was essentially a metal coffin with some life support built in. The dogs had been specially selected, not too big, not too small, calm temperament, and presumably no strong opinions about being fired into the void, although who knows, they're dogs. The rocket ignited with a roar that could be heard 10 kilometers away, climbing to 110 kilometers, officially crossing the boundary into space before the capsule separated and began its descent. 20 minutes after launch, the capsule thumped back to Earth. When the recovery team opened it, two rather confused but very alive dogs emerged. Desik and Sigan had just become the first Earthlings to see the curvature of their home planet, though I doubt they appreciated the view. But here's the heartbreaking part. Desik's triumph was short-lived. Just a week later, he was sent up again with another dog named Lisa. This time the parachute failed and both dogs died on impact. These flights paved the way for Laika, the famous space dog who would orbit the Earth in 1957. Though, unlike Desik and Sigan, Laika was never intended to return. Her spacecraft was a one-way ticket, a flying tomb that would orbit the Earth for months with her body inside. Progress, it seems, demanded sacrifice. And in the Soviet Union, they sacrificed man's best friend. Becoming a cosmodrome. Anyway, by the early 1960s, Kapustin Yar had evolved from a simple missile range into something a lot more sophisticated, a full-fledged cosmodrome, a gateway to the stars. The transformation was marked by a special moment on March the 16th, 1962, at Launch Complex 86-1, catchy name again, Soviets. A small rocket sat on the pad. Atop it was Cosmos 1, the first step in what would become an endless series of Soviet satellites. I mean, not endless because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The Cosmos program was the Soviet Union's catch-all designation for satellites that they didn't want to talk about. Weather satellite, Cosmos. Spy satellite, Cosmos. Failed Venus probe that never left Earth orbit, Cosmos. By the time the Soviet Union fell, they'd launched over 2,500 Cosmos satellites, and nobody outside the program knew what half of them bloody did. Kapustin Yar became the workhorse launch site for these smaller, mysterious payloads, while Baikonur got the glory launches, Yuri Gagarin, Sputnik, the lunar probes. Kapustin Yar did the dirty work, launching satellite after satellite into orbit with all the fanfare of a city bus leaving its stop. Sari Shagan and Project K. And here's where things get properly terrifying. Kapustin Yar wasn't just launching things into space, it was launching missiles 2,000 kilometers across the Soviet Union toward another test range called Sari Shagan in Kazakhstan. It was sort of the world's longest and most dangerous shooting range, if you will. Kapustin Yar would fire missiles carrying dummy warheads, and Sari Shagan would try to shoot them down with anti-ballistic missiles. It was like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet. But the real nightmare fuel, that came with Project K, conducted between 1961 and 1962. These were not tests of conventional weapons. These were high-altitude nuclear detonations designed to understand what happens when you set off a nuclear bomb in space, because apparently that's just something we needed to know. On October the 22nd, 1962, right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was already just seconds from midnight, the Soviets launched a missile from Kapustin Yar carrying a 300-kiloton nuclear warhead. That, by the way, about 15 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The warhead detonated 290 kilometers above the Earth, that is, solidly in space. The results were spectacular and they were terrifying. The explosion created an electromagnetic pulse that swept across the steppe like an invisible tsunami. The city of Karaganda, 1,000 kilometers away, the lights went out. A 570-kilometer telephone line that's longer than the length of England had all of its fuses blown. The power grid across an area the size of France was disrupted. One witness described seeing the lights flicker in his apartment and then die. Then the radio went silent. Then he looked outside and saw the northern horizon glowing with an aurora that shouldn't exist at that latitude. Now, the Soviets had instrumented the region to measure these effects. They wanted to know what would happen. And they found out. You could cripple an entire nation's infrastructure without directly destroying a single building. This was a perfect Cold War weapon. Maximum disruption, minimum immediate casualties. Submarines on the steppe. Now let's move on to something a little bit more bizarre. In the middle of the bone-dry steppe, thousands of kilometers from the nearest ocean, the Soviets built a submarine simulator. The SM-49 rocking simulator was exactly what it sounds like. It's a massive mechanical system that could replicate the rolling and pitching of a submarine at sea. A full-scale submarine hull mounted on hydraulic actuators, lurching back and forth in the middle of a desert. Why, Simon, you might be asking? Well, that's because the Soviet Navy needed to test submarine-launched ballistic missiles, but they weren't about to risk an actual submarine or its crew on unproven weapons. So, they brought the submarine to the desert. Engineers would load missiles into the simulator's launch tubes, the whole apparatus would start rocking to simulate rough seas, and then they'd try to launch. early tests were, let's just say, educational. Missiles designed to fly straight up had an alarming tendency to fly sideways when launched from a moving platform. The absurdity of all of this wasn't lost on the workers. One engineer later recalled, "We used to joke that we were the Soviet Navy's desert fleet, the only submarines in history that needed to worry about sandstorms instead of depth charges." The Mach 3 monster. In the late 1950s, before intercontinental ballistic missiles became reliable, the Soviets explored another option for delivering nuclear mayhem across the globe: the Lavochkin LA-350 Burya, which translates to storm, by the way, you're so welcome. The Burya was a cruise missile the size of a fighter jet, powered by ramjet engines that could push it to Mach 3.2 over 2,400 miles an hour. The tests were spectacular. A Burya flew approximately 6,500 kilometers, that's Moscow to New York with fuel to spare, and hit within 10 kilometers of its target. For a weapon designed to carry a multi-megaton nuclear warhead, being 10 kilometers off target was, close enough. But the Burya had a fatal flaw. ICBMs were getting better and cheaper. Why build a complex cruise missile that took 2 hours to reach its target when an ICBM could do it in 30 minutes? The program was cancelled, and the Storm never flew in anger. But look, a facility this important, it couldn't stay secret forever. The West had heard rumors, refugee reports, intercepted communications, the occasional defector's tale. But they needed proof. They needed pictures. Enter the spies in the sky. There are stories, never officially confirmed by the British government because that ain't the British way, of an RAF Canberra reconnaissance aircraft overflying Kapustin Yar in 1953. The Canberra was a jet bomber converted for high-altitude photo reconnaissance. According to the legend, and that's all it is, the aircraft took off from West Germany, flew deep into Soviet airspace, photographed Kapustin Yar, and landed in Iran, friendly at the time, despite being intercepted by MiG fighters. The photos allegedly showed launch pads, assembled buildings, and most importantly, rockets. Really big rockets, the kind of rockets that could carry nuclear warheads. And soon after, the Americans got serious about watching Kapustin Yar. U-2 spy planes, those impossibly delicate aircraft that flew so high they were almost in space, made the range a priority target. Today, of course, anyone with Google Earth can look at Kapustin Yar. You can see the launch pads, the roads, even individual buildings. The secret base, not so secret anymore. But that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Fast forward to today, and Kapustin Yar is still very much in business. If anything, it's actually busier than ever. Between 2012 and 2015, Russia fired a series of Topol RS-26 and RS-24 missiles from Kapustin Yar to Saryshagin. These were not Cold War relics. These were modern ICBMs testing new warheads designed specifically to defeat American missile defense systems. In 2021, the Russian Ministry of Defense released a video of S-500 air defense system tests at Kapustin Yar. The S-500 is Russia's answer to hypersonic missiles, a system supposedly capable of intercepting targets traveling at Mach 20. The video showed a missile streaking into the sky, then a distant flash as it destroyed its target. Russia wanted the world to see. This was definitely a message. It says we're still here, and we're still dangerous. But the range's continuing importance was dramatically illustrated in July 2024. Ukrainian long-range drones, basically remote-controlled aircraft packed with explosive, struck Kapustin Yar. Satellite imagery showed scorch marks at several facilities. Storage buildings were damaged, launch infrastructure possibly compromised. We don't know for sure. Just 3 months earlier, in April 2024, Russia had announced an ICBM test from the site, a not-so-subtle reminder to the world that despite the war in Ukraine, despite sanctions, despite everything, Russia's nuclear arsenal was still operational. After nearly 80 years, Kapustin Yar remains what it always was, a place where humanity's most destructive impulses take physical form. But that's not the end of our video today. I promised you we were going to talk about aliens, and we shall. Get your tinfoil hats out! For decades, UFO enthusiasts have called this place Russia's Area 51 or Russia's Roswell. And the story's pretty wild. Underground alien laboratories stretching for miles beneath the steppe, crashed UFOs being reverse-engineered in hidden hangars, alien bodies in cryogenic storage, even alleged battles between Soviet forces and hostile extraterrestrials. It all sounds so real. Now, the conspiracy theorists point to the evidence, the forced relocation of Zhitkar village. What were they hiding? The extreme secrecy? Why so paranoid? The strange lights in the sky? Surely not all rockets? They were. There's also the fact that even today, large areas of Kapustin Yar are strictly off limits. I mean, What don't they want us to see? Oh, I don't know, conspiracy theorists. Maybe military secrets, maybe? One popular story claims that in 1948, a silver disc crashed near Kapustin Yar and was recovered by the Soviet military. Another tale describes underground tunnels where alien technology was studied and copied, explaining the Soviet Union's rapid advancement in rocketry. And here's what we actually have when it comes to evidence. Nothing. Cool. No credible witnesses, no leaked documents, no physical evidence. Niet, comrade. What we do have is a thoroughly documented history of very human achievements. Thousands of declassified documents, satellite imagery, defected testimonies, even Russian sources that openly discuss much of what happened there. The missiles, the satellites, the nuclear tests. The truth is, reality is more incredible than any alien conspiracy. This is where humans learned to throw nuclear weapons across continents at speed that would have seemed like magic just a generation before. Where nuclear explosions in space fried power grids hundreds of kilometers away. Where cruise missiles flew at 3 times the speed of sound with deadly accuracy. We don't need aliens when humans are perfectly capable of building such magnificent and terrifying things all by themselves. Alright, but before we end, let's pull back from the big narrative today and talk about the people. Because behind every rocket launch, every nuclear test, every secret project, there were human beings paying the price. The engineers and scientists who worked at Kapustin Yar lived in a strange bubble. They'd better food than most Soviets, fresh vegetables in a country where millions subsisted on cabbage and potatoes. They had cinema showing the latest films. Their children went to schools with the best teachers. But they also lived in a prison without bars. Phone calls were monitored. Travel was restricted. Many couldn't tell their own families exactly what they did for a living. I work with rockets. It was about as specific as they could get. I work on the ways that friction ratios affect steering outcomes in aeronautical use under reduced gravity loads. And if you get that reference, you legend, tell me in the comments. They missed weddings, funerals, birthdays, because leaving Znamensk required permission that might not come. One engineer's widow later recalled, he would leave for months at a time. I knew he was at Kapustin Yar, but that's all. When he came home, he couldn't talk about his work. He'd have nightmares, sometimes, calling out numbers and coordinates, but when I asked, he'd say it was nothing. Then there were the soldiers, young conscripts mostly stationed at this remote base to guard secrets they didn't understand. They stood watch in temperatures that ranged from -30 in winter to +40 in summer. They cleaned up after failed launches, sometimes handling toxic rocket fuel with minimal protection. How many developed cancer years later? How many died young? The Soviet Union didn't keep those statistics. I mean, they probably did, but they're just not telling anybody. And what about the civilians affected by those nuclear tests? The people of Karaganda who lost power when the EMP struck, the telephone operators whose equipment was fried. They were unwitting participants in an experiment they never agreed to, collateral damage in a war that never quite happened. So why should we care about a Soviet missile range in the middle of nowhere? Why does this place matter to anyone who isn't a Cold War historian or a bit of a weapons nerd? Well, that's because Kapustin Yar is where the modern world was kind of born. This is where humanity learned to touch space. Before Kapustin Yar, rockets were essentially just really big fireworks. After, they were vehicles that could carry life beyond Earth. This is where the nuclear age merged with the missile age to create the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the balance of terror that kept the Cold War cold. And perhaps most importantly, Kapustin Yar reminds us that the most significant places in history aren't always the ones we remember. While the world watched Cape Canaveral and cheered for Apollo, Kapustin Yar was quietly reshaping the balance of global power. Stand on the step today, and you might not immediately realize you're at one of the most important sites in human history. The grass stretches endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional launch tower or radar dome. But look closer, and you can read the history of the last 80 years in the landscape. The scorched concrete pads that held the rockets that started the space age, the craters in the distance, failed launches that almost certainly killed people. In the end, Kapustin Yar was never really about aliens or even just about rockets. It was about the extraordinary and terrible things humans can achieve when driven by fear, ambition, and the pressure of history. Thank you for watching.